If you're into basketball, you know that. With the exception of Larry Bird, the greatest players in the history of the NBA are all black. Players such as Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson, Kobe Bryant, Shaquille O'Neal, Wilt Chamberlain, Tim Duncan, or Bill Russell immediately spring to mind to any basketball aficionado. Likewise, if you're into American football, also known in the US simply as football, you know that 90% of the NFL's players are black. Of course, many historic white players are among the greatest football players of all time, but with the exception of Tom Brady, the overwhelming majority of nowadays greatest players are black. How about the 100 meters dash? Well, of the 25 fastest men in the world, only one is of non-African descent, and he is not white, he is Chinese. Better yet, as of 2023, Su Bingtian, that's his name, is the only person of non-African origin to ever run the 100 meters dash in less than 9.9 seconds. I could go on and on. High jump, long jump, boxing. In each and every single sports that requires speed, strength, and power, athletes of African descent have been dominating for decades. Why? Well, simply because they are the physically strongest and most athletic people on Earth. Now, you may ask, wasn't this video supposed to be about slavery? Why am I talking about the prowess of athletes of African descent in sports? Well, for a simple fact. Really, as mentioned earlier, people of African descent are the strongest people on Earth. As such, how come they got victimized by meek Europeans? How come an estimated 12.5 million Africans ended up enslaved by Europeans? Oh, and also, another 14 million by the Arabs and/or Muslims as well, by the way. Yes, the trans-Saharan slave trade, which still exists to this day, is conveniently overlooked by race-baiting historians in the West. But it's been going on for over 14 centuries now, and it's still going strong. Check out Libya or Nigeria, for instance. Yet only white people are blamed for, well, something they put an end to more than a century and a half ago. But that's a story for another time. What I would like to know is how the transatlantic slave trade was made possible in the first place. I mean, Africans are much stronger than Europeans. Why didn't they defend themselves? Better yet, until the 19th century, Europeans didn't dare wander too far from the African coast out of fear of catching malaria, a common disease in sub-Saharan Africa, that killed any European crazy enough to venture inland. How did those Europeans lay their hands on African slaves in such conditions? Again, the question is carefully avoided by historians and black race baiters. The inconvenient truth is that Africans were enslaved by their fellow Africans, who then sold their captive fellows into slavery, either to the Arabs or to the Europeans. From that point onward, obviously, African slaves were covered in chains, from which it was impossible to escape, no matter how strong they were. Likewise, fleeing from the ships that brought them to the Americas was not an option either, as they spent weeks on the high seas in shackles. Eventually they got sold to slave owners and ended up on plantations, where hundreds of slaves were often guarded by a handful of white men. Remember? Those white men who are not as strong as people of African descent? How come that, on each and every single plantation, from the United States to Brazil, slaves were unable to fight their owners? Is it really just the bullwhip that kept them in check? Of course not, unless you dish hundreds of strikes. A bullwhip is not a lethal weapon. 10 black men swarming a lone white guard armed with a bullwhip would have made mincemeat of the guard. Yet they extremely rarely did. And when they did, they miserably failed. Every single time. How? How come black men couldn't free themselves? How come it took white men from the north to free the black slaves living in the south? Nowadays, everybody takes it for granted that white Americans waged war on their fellow white Americans to free black men. Everybody takes it for granted that 600,000 white men gave their lives to free black men. Similarly, everybody takes it for granted that white Europeans put an end to slavery in Africa and the Middle East when Africans never fought for themselves. Better yet, since white men left Africa, as a consequence of the end of the colonial era, slavery came back to Africa with a vengeance. So much so that there has never been as many slaves in the world as today. By the way, how often have black men taken up the arms to fight for white men? Never. Not in the US, nor in Africa has that ever happened. Yet, somehow, it is the white man, the only race that ever fought on behalf of another race. That's called a racist, go figure, sure. A few Africans and North Africans have fought for the French or British armies during World War I and World War II, but never have Africans or Middle Easterners decided to defend white people of their own accord. But I digress. The fact of the matter is that, notwithstanding the physical superiority of Africans over Europeans, the enslavement of Africans was made possible, not by white men, but by African men capturing and selling their fellow Africans into slavery. See, Africans would have easily averted the transatlantic slave trade had they cooperated against the white man. As a matter of fact, they could have averted the trans-Saharan slave trade as well. Yes, Africans could have prevented the enslavement of 26 million Africans, but they didn't. Quite the opposite. Africans were all too happy to sell members of other tribes and make a hefty profit from the slave trade. Yet, you will never hear a single black activist demanding reparations admit this simple fact. If it hadn't been for Africans selling each other out to white men, the transatlantic slave trade would never have existed. Yes, African slave merchants are an integral part of the slave trade, but you will never hear race baiters mention this fact because it is not historical truth they're looking for. They are fighting for personal gains. Ask Patrice Cullors, one of the co-founders of BLM, who took a hefty chunk of the donations to BLM to buy a multi-million-dollar mansion in a wealthy, white neighborhood in LA. You can't make it up. See, here's what I will never understand coming from 21st century progressives. People fending for themselves and cooperating to discover new lands and build new empires are vilified. But on the other hand, opportunistic people taking advantage of the white man's enterprise, who were all too happy to sell their countrymen into slavery, their actions are never questioned. Then again, this is the 21st century we're talking about. A century dominated by the progressive ideology. And unlike conservative capitalism, which rewards successful people, progressivism can only destroy the successful man's achievements and pity victims of their own turpitudes. But keep this in mind, the very people who made the transatlantic slave trade possible, the first link in the transatlantic slave business, were the Africans themselves, the white man, and let's not forget the Arabs as well, were mere customers.